Very much for returning. We've been spending a lot of time in the last 2 days talking about consideration of humans in medtech, human design, human use, and we thought it was fitting to have a really important conversation about, or a presentation by Bill Betton, who I just met this week. I'm very happy to make his acquaintance. It's just about his own personal journey through the healthcare system. So he comes at it from a perspective of someone who died in the world medtech person, and I know his eyes were opened by a lot of his experiences. So without taking any time away from Bill, I'd like to hand the mic over to him and listen to the conversation.
All right, thanks very much. Well, thank you. I'll stand up here, and I like to walk around, so I'm just going to use this mic, and we'll make this an interactive conversation if you want. So as I go through this, I'm going to talk about, as he said, a little background. I've been building products for over 40 years, software, electronics, systems, a lot of that, most of that in the medical world, a bit of aerospace and defense and some industrial as well. But the bottom line is I've been making things for many, many years. Much of that in medical. I've worked on everything from heart-lung machines to hearing aids to implantable devices. For the last 8 years, I led business development at contract design and manufacturing firms, specializing in med products. So when I wasn't building them on the inside as head of engineering or something, I was out talking to other people about putting teams together to solve problems. So bottom line, built lots of different things, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey through the medical system and how it became personal for me. And hopefully you'll learn some lessons with regard to the way I did about traversing our medical system, which is not a journey for the sick. And unfortunately, that's usually about the time we have to do it. And it also gave me a different perspective on some of these products that I've been building for years, and gave me a different perspective on what it means to build not just for the user, but actually for the patient. So I'm going to talk about my journey and kind of walk through that a little bit. So kind of a prelude. I walked in, as this engineer walks in the doctor's office, and the neurosurgeon says, "So you're the interesting case." That is not what you want to hear when you walk into the doctor's office. And that's exactly what happened to me when I met with the neurosurgeon that ended up doing something with me. I'll talk a little bit more about what that journey is. Fortunately, there was a happy ending. That's what we'd like to hear about, but it doesn't always work out that way. But I became a very interesting case. And how did I get there? My journey began actually quite some time ago. So for those of you who are like of the male persuasion like I am and tend to ignore symptoms, bottom line recommendation, don't ignore your symptoms as long as I potentially did. In February of 2019, I went to my general practitioner because I had a leg problem. And that leg basically, to make a long story short, they thought it was a pinched nerve, but when every nerve in my lower left leg fired off and it shook me out of bed one morning in February, I said, okay, this isn't normal. And so I went to the neurologist. They were testing me for neuropathy. And at that point, they're saying, well, what else is going on with you? And I have a very loving wife who threatened me, and she said, don't you dare not tell them something and ignore these symptoms. So I mentioned these other little symptoms like, well, I've had a few headaches for a while and auras in my vision that most people describe if they have migraines or something. And she said, well, you're over 40 and you're having headaches. It should indicate that you should go get an MRI. And she said, it's probably nothing. We'll give you an MRI and that. And I said, okay, I thought I could push it off a little bit. Her comment was, all right, I said, when can we do this? And she said, well, how about right now? We just had a cancellation. So I went in for a simple little neurology test and testing strength and doing all of that. Next thing I know, I'm spending my time lying in this MRI machine. And bottom line, when she came out, she's standing there, and she had indicated she probably wouldn't be there. She said, well, we found something. We found that you have a brain tumor. And when you hear the words brain and tumor together in a sentence, you get really nervous. You know, I'd lost a brother-in-law 2 years ago to brain cancer. My head goes there, and she says, it's probably not cancer. 90% of these tumors are non-cancerous. It's like, okay, the engineer in me says that leaves 10%. Of the other kind, and we won't know till we get in there. And so, jumping forward a little bit to the end, on April 18th through the 20th, I had 7+ hours of brain surgery. I spent a night in the ICU and a night in the med-surg floor and 6 weeks of sleeping upright after that. So that's the high-level part of the journey. Now I'm going to talk about some of the pieces and talk about what it was like to engage in this process of going in, thinking you're invincible, and finding out all of a sudden that you're not. So I mentioned being in an MRI machine, and I never realized 30 plus years ago I was beaming images off the USS George Washington back to Bethesda and Walter Reed, involved in imaging, diagnostic imaging. We were doing CTs, MRs, digital x-rays. I was working at 3M at the time, and I ran their PACS activities. So connecting things up, some of the earliest connected medicine, sending images back and forth. 2 years ago, I had the great privilege of meeting Dr. Raymond Damadian on the left. He's acknowledged and recognized as the inventor of the MRI. And he was the CEO of the first practical company doing it called Phonak. And I happened to be at a conference, and he and I sat down and I got to have lunch with him. 2 years later, I'm laying in something that at least he had a role in bringing to be. Today you can see the machine. Tomorrow maybe we'll do something else. But here I am having these thoughts running through my head about doing all this when I'm strapped into that machine listening to the magnets whirring and going. And if you've never been in an MRI, it's an interesting experience, even if you know what's going on. But when your head's locked in a cage and they're imaging your brain and all you're hearing is, in my case, late 70s rock music that I was listening to as I was going through this, all I could think about is what a weird way to be going through this process. I knew the inventor. I've played with the machines a lot. I had never been in one until that exact minute. And since then, in the last 6 months, I've had 6 different MRIs for a variety of purposes. So I now feel like a little bit of an expert. The diagnosis, this brain tumor, was what they call a meningioma. And basically, they said, if you're going to have a brain tumor, this is the one to have. Because it's basically a self-contained, it doesn't grow much outside of its contained area, and it's in the brain and spinal cord just inside the skull or along the spine. And they are slow growing. This has probably been with me for 10, 15 plus years before I ever got to the point where I started evidencing some symptoms. And as many as 90%, they said, and this came out of Wikipedia because I had to go look it up because I'm an engineer and I had to figure out what the heck is going on with me. One other rule of thumb, when you walk out of the neurologist and you just found out you have a tumor, don't call your wife on the way home and say, honey, I had the analysis done and they found out I have a brain tumor. That's what I did. I was kind of, what do? You go into a little state of denial and shock and all of that. So hopefully you'll learn from some of my lessons. This is my tumor in March of 2019. The slice on the left is a slice through horizontally. Top right back part of my skull, that big white mass is the tumor. Roughly between a golf ball, tennis ball in size, and you can see that it's nice and round. Now, my friends might say, obviously it demonstrates I had a lot of room in my head for things besides brains. But what really happened is the brain is a compressible medium, and it was pressing against my brain, and the top left back part of your head controls the left side of your body. And so the symptoms I was seeing, partial paralysis of the leg every so often, the numbness, some fire in it, the headaches, some double vision, things like that, ultimately manifested itself when it got big enough to start really interfering with me. So what next? So I dove into this, tackling it as a problem, and there's a lot of talk about transparency, and I'm going to tell you there is no transparency in this world. Trying to find, I called my insurance provider. Well, of course, all their doctors are wonderful. They can't tell you anything other than that. So I called lots of my friends in the business, and I said, guys, tell me who you'd have do this. And they gave me some names. Good buddy of mine, the first one, I checked with them. Well, she's just retiring, and so she's not taking new patients, and went through all of that. I reviewed some online bios. I actually had a list of 8 doctors. I interviewed 2, and I made a decision. So that whole process of selecting, how are you going to pick somebody who's going to walk through your brain? Hopefully it's not anything you have to go through, but when you face it, it's like, how do I do this? So my wife and I went to interview the doctors. And I met with one gentleman who had come highly recommended, and he was probably in his mid-40s. I asked him, how many of these have you done? He said, well, I've done a couple hundred of these. And he was very solicitous. He talked to me about it. He explained what was going on. He trained at Mayo Clinic. He had a year residency there, and I do a lot of work with the Mayo Clinic. as a consultant. And, so we had a little bit to talk about, and we talked shop for a little bit. And, I left feeling like, well, this should happen. And I said, could I put it off? And he said, no, you probably should get it done because you're probably having seizures. That's what's going on with your leg. And we don't want you to have too big a seizure, and we're going to give you some medicine and a lot of things that go along with it. The next day, I called his nurse back to ask a couple questions that were still nagging me. And that night, about 8:30 at night, I got a call from him. He said, well, this is Dr. So-and-so. And I heard you had some questions. I just wanted to answer your questions. And I said, wow, this is really kind of cool. The neurosurgeon's calling me. And I said, well, I'm getting another opinion. I'm doing this. He said, that's fine. I don't care really if I do your surgery or not. I just want to make sure you get it done and that you feel good about it. And so we talked for 15 minutes, and I was like, wow, this is really magical. 3 days later, we went to visit another doctor at the other end of the spectrum. And I'm giving ages because perhaps there's a generational thing here a little bit, but I'm sure you can find doctors at all age brackets. This doctor was in his 60s and came really highly recommended. He was the second one on the list for the other one who'd retired. And when I'd mention neurosurgeon around town, they'd say, oh, this guy? And I said, well, yeah, that's him. He'd done several thousand of these operations and talked to us about it very matter-of-factly. Here's what happens, here's what goes on. We take a hole out of your head and make this happen. And I said, well, should I go to Mayo? I know people at Mayo, and of course to me a brain tumor that's a big deal, right? I mean, there's no such thing as minor brain surgery unless it's being done to somebody that you don't know, right? I mean, for me it was a big deal. And he looked at it and he said, well, he said, I trained in a teaching hospital, and Mayo's a wonderful place. There's magic there. I mean, trust me, it's wonderful. But his comment was, they're a teaching hospital, and quite honestly, your brain tumor isn't that big a deal. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of these in the U.S. every year, and they'll hand it to a teaching resident, and that's what will happen. And do you want to be a teaching case? Well, no, not particularly. I want the best guy that will do this. So we had the discussion and we left, and we walked out, and my wife looked at me and she said, well, how are we going to decide? And I said, well, you've already made up your mind, haven't you? She's the non-engineering, teacher-oriented, touchy-feely, really great judge of character. She said, yep, we're going to the first guy because he made you feel and look like a real person. He had the conversation with you. He did that. I have a sense that he cared about you. Second guy, technically, probably, perhaps even superior. But he saw me as a case number. He didn't necessarily see me as a real person. So we bit the bullet. We made a decision. We chose this doctor. And I'll use his name here because for those of us who are kind of tech fans, it's kind of neat. His name, honest to God, was Dr. McIver. Not MacGyver, close, but he gets a lot of jokes about that. What's that? Yeah. And Dr. McIver, and so that sort of sold it too, and I asked him if he needed any extra duct tape or something like that. But we chose him. So that was an interesting part of the puzzle. Whoops, I jumped ahead. I'll show you back to this in just a second. Because the other part of transparency I want to talk about is hard enough to find doctors and to go through this process and figure out who do you want to cut you open and deal with all of that. My general practitioner I've been with him for 30 years. He's retiring. Scares me to death because I got to find a new general practitioner. He's the guy I opened up to over 30 years of all of that. Now I'm picking someone that I met for a 1-hour conversation in his office and 15 minutes on the phone, and he's going to be cutting me open. That was easy compared to the process of trying to find out how much it's going to cost. Okay, and I went through that to try and do that. My insurance company told me, make sure you pick a surgeon and a facility that's in your plan. Okay, and we've all heard horror stories about how knees can cost you anywhere from $6,000 to $25,000 depending on where you go. Or in Minneapolis, where I'm from, they talk about, there's a case that was going on where 2 women went in to have baby in the same hospital, and depending on fate, one of them ended up with an anesthesiologist who was not in her plan, and she had no way of predicting that. She's in labor. She needs to have the baby come out, and they had an out-of-network anesthesiologist, and it cost 3x to have that done, and she had no control over that. I tried to find out what was going on. I looked up codes. You wouldn't believe all the codes that are associated with taking a hole out of your head. There's a code for taking it out. There's a code for putting it back in. There's a code for what happens if they don't put it back in, which kind of left me feeling a little queasy. But I couldn't find out anywhere how much this was going to cost, so I just went into it and said basically, well, that's it. I'm going to live with whatever the cost is. I'm going to trust the insurance to work. I will come back to the financial picture later, because at the end of this, months after the process, that's when you find out what it really cost you. Okay, so 3 weeks from discovery to, I should have warned those who are squeamish here and all of that. Sorry about that. 3 weeks into this, I'm having a meningioma removal. The one on the left is not mine. I asked the doctor if he had taken any pictures of it, and he said, nope, we didn't. The picture on the right, however, is my head, and it's post-surgery, probably about 2 days after surgery, something like 40 stitches. So basically they scalped me, pulled it all the way back. They peel your scalp back. They saw a big hole in the head. Roughly that purple circle and line around there is the hole in the head. Because I'd asked the doctor, well, this will be minimally invasive, won't it? And his comment was, you know, I like a lot of room. So when I go in, I'm going to make a big hole, and I'm going to be able to get to things. Okay, doc, I mean, you know what you're doing. I'd really like a small hole in the head. It was a big hole in the head. Yeah. And they helped me out. And by the way, if you have questions about this, interrupt me, feel free. This is supposed to be a little bit of a conversation, and we have a bit of time here. So otherwise, you can save your questions at the end, but I'm happy to take them now if you ask anything about this.
I'd ask just because I've interviewed Bill before for this past advice talks, but I kind of recall like one of the big things that struck me was that you really took time to shop around and find a doctor, and I mean, how much, that just seems like really good advice for anybody who is facing something serious.
Yeah, I consider myself an educated consumer, particularly in this space, right? I mean, most of us work in healthcare in some form or another, have been around it and do all of that. And I tried really hard. So I called my insurance company, I talked through them. I called multiple physicians to get an idea of where to go, who to see, and all of that. Then I read online bios, which is an interesting thing because all the good stuff's there, but you can never find anything bad. Consumer Reports sort of does a hospital listing in Minnesota. They try and grade hospitals and things like that, but finding out about surgeons and about facilities and all of that is really a pretty tough thing to do. I encourage you to do it. Be a smart consumer about it. Ask people. It turned out after the fact, I found out that I had picked a wonderful surgeon, but when they tell you, oh, by the way, he's not only a brain surgeon, but he's a trauma surgeon too. So if something goes wrong, he can fix you. Again, that's nice, but not what I wanted to hear. Tom.
How different would your research been if you had been someone who had contacts in the industry, who had people follow?
The question was, how different would my research have been if I didn't have contacts in the industry? Quite honestly, which is I think the case for most people, you do what the insurance company says. You'll get a list of names, and it's like, when do you want your surgery? We'll schedule you. We'll talk about all this. And one of the things I haven't talked about, so I'm gonna digress for just a moment. Let's talk about electronic health records. Okay, I had my doctor, same doctor for 30 years. I go to a different neurologist. I'd been referred there. When I walked out, I had a disc of my images with me. And I was asked to, when I started to enter into the insurance system, they said, well, do you have your images? And I said, well, can't you get them? And they said, well, you better bring a disc just in case. And every form you fill out has a fax number on it. And it's like, maybe you need to fax records over somewhere. I said, if I don't have a fax machine for a long time. You take, and they won't take email, they won't take PDFs. So it's go to FedEx, and put it in the fax machine and send it over to them. So the whole issue of taking records with you, which I really haven't touched on, was a big deal. Because all of a sudden I went and was going to lots of exams, having a lot of people take a look at me, getting ready for the pre-surgery stuff, which is a whole regimen in and of itself. They're worried about infections nowadays, so guess what? 3 days before the surgery, you get to shower with some really icky stuff. And it's pink, foaming, whatever, and I don't really want to know what it does, but you put it on and you shower with it, and the night before, you have to have clean bedding for 2 nights before you go in. My wife loved that, and all that sort of thing. Getting ready for surgery was a big challenge. Getting records there was a big challenge. Finding the physicians. In most cases, I think most people just give up and they'll do whatever they're told with whomever they're told. So that's what would have happened. You know, I'm probably paranoid enough I would have called anyway, but I wouldn't have had the success in finding the doctors and the surgeons. I would have had the list and I would have to figure it out completely on my own. So, one of the things I should mention as well, it's funny to me and it's funny to the surgeon. So I'm getting ready to go in. After all this prep, we're getting ready to go in. They finally have my records, sort of, kind of. I'm in there in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning. They're doing another MRI where they put little posts on my head. It's basically a GPS system mapping for the surgery that they're going to do. So I look kind of like Frankenstein with little pegs, except I had them all over my head. 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm doing that. About 7, the surgeon comes in, brings in his whole team. They all march in. They're meeting me for the first time, pretty much. And I said, well, guys, it's like this. I do med device development, so obviously I'm an educated consumer. But I'm going to tell you how educated I am because yesterday, the day before, literally, I was at the Mayo Clinic. And we were doing, I was working on a new medical device, a surgical device, something that they're working on. We had a cadaver clinic. And I don't know if many of you have ever participated in cadaver clinics, but basically we had 5 cadavers, and we had 5 instruments, and we had 5 surgeons, and I spent the day there monitoring and looking at the use of our instruments and taking records and notes and doing that. And the next day, I'm walking in to have surgery. So I looked at this whole team assembled around me. I'm starting to feel probably pretty happy from the juice that they're starting to put in to get me ready to go. And I look at them and say, I tell them that story. I say, yesterday I spent the day with 5 bodies and 5 surgeons and all that. Today your job is to make sure I'm not one of them. They thought that was kind of cool. They laughed and said, well, we understand the sentiment, but we've never had anybody tell us that the day before they spent the day with dead bodies. So anyway, here's the surgery. Go in, wake up 7.5 hours later. I have, this doctor was noted for putting a big bandage on with a top knot on it, and so I basically had a turban on, and I came out, and everybody's standing around looking at me, and I will say this, magically, anesthesia is much better than it used to be. 25 years ago, the only time I'd ever had surgery, I had minimally invasive surgery in my back, so I'd never been under before. It was a much different recovery process coming out of it. When I woke up here, I felt really good. You know, it was kind of like, this wasn't bad. So, connected patient, I wanted to talk about that because I do a lot of connected health stuff. I talked about the radiology and beaming images. About a decade ago, I was head of engineering at a firm called Medical, and we make pulse oximeters. And we did the first connected Bluetooth pulse oximeters. And so I've been very involved in wearables and devices and connections and all of that. And unfortunately, after all of this, and again, this is going through my brain as I've been developing products and I'm laying there, the stuff on the left is kind of the way it looks. That's a cartoon that was done, but you could see the way it looks with me actually laying there with a silly grin on my face because the anesthesia and the drugs they were putting into me still felt apparently pretty good. But I was connected for blood pressure, heart rate, pulse ox, all those things there. And almost every single one of those, with the exception of a catheter, I've had conversations with over the years with med device companies either that I work for or that I'm working with to try and make them wireless so that we get away from this. And for those of you, the picture on the left and where I ended up is far more common. That's what happens when you come out, and I had all of those particular things in there. And one of the nastiest things was the leg compression stuff. Anybody ever have, any of you guys had to have those in the hospital? Those things are sitting there pumping your calf every hour or whatever the cycle is, and they don't want to let you out of bed. And of course, when you're in ICU, it's easy because you have catheter, you're not moving, you don't feel like doing much. But every hour, once upon a time, I used to be a pretty good runner and run a lot, and so I have a relatively low resting heart rate. Well, you combine that with the effects of all of this, my heart rate would drop below 50 as I'm laying there in bed, and that darn alarm would start going off, and they come rushing in because your heart rate's down, and I explain to them the situation, and they turn it down for a little while. But basically, every hour on the hour in ICU, with the alarms don't go off, they're waking you up to take your vitals and to talk to you and to do all of that anyway. I know that there are better ways to do this, but we haven't, for a whole bunch of reasons, implemented or done them. And when you're a patient, you're an object laying there with lots of wires and stuff hooked up to you. It doesn't feel bad the first day, but after a while it kind of gets to you. So part of what I want to do in the message is, guys, those of us who are developing sensors of all sorts that want to be wireless and all that. Let's get it done so it'll be really, really nice. I do a lot in the eldercare market. I'm working hard in that space because we're all getting older. I'm a baby boomer. I'm in that generation that is headed towards home. I want wearable monitors that are, don't intervene in my life and that will take care of me. In the hospital, this is what I look like. So, in recovery, the first thing they said, who are you, where are you, and what's your level of pain? Those are the first 3 questions. Had the who am I worked out okay. The where am I was a little bit of a hassle because I had been married to a woman who was a nurse in that very same hospital in the old days, and I knew it by another name. So I wake up, my brain's been muddled with, they say, where are you? And I gave a name that the young nurses there looked at me and said, what? And I said, oh, it used to be called that, and I'd have to go through the explanation. Because how do you know when you've had your brain muddled with it, you're the same person? I don't know. And it's scary. And what's your level of pain in the days of opioid and all of that? That question was asked to me every single time, and I'm not blaming them, because if you have a truly painful surgery, then there's good reason to manage the pain, stay out in front of it, and do all of that. But I was very, very careful and afraid of opioids. Actually, the week I was home, they had, that was when the arrests were happening for the opioid execs pushing things, so that gave me one lesson. And there was a TV show I watched that, a detective thing that was all about that. So it scared me to death. And so I said, I'll live with a little pain, but those questions happened all the time. ICU in that first night, I talked about it, completely wired, alarms all night. It's not a great place to rest, recover, or do anything like that. The second day, they said, well, we think you're doing well enough. We're going to move you to the med-surg floor. The nice thing about that was a nice big bright room, longer interval between wake-up times. I think it was every 2 hours or something after that instead of 1 hour. But the physical and mental evaluation started. Physical is not bad, right? You get up, they hold you on behind you, and they walk you around the hotel or around the hospital. Too much travel lately. Around the hospital, they're evaluating you, climbing some steps, you're doing this, that, and the other. But then the mental evaluations start. Okay, they've been mucking around in my brain. I make my living with my brain, And how do I know I'm the same person? Because they took a tennis ball out of me that wasn't technically part of my brain, but it was pushing on it. So when they start with the mental evaluations, here's my checklist of what we're going through. And they gave me, here's 6 words. Repeat them back. And they said, at the end of this, we're going to ask you those words again. While we're going through connecting dots and numbers and going through this evaluation, I start to panic. It's like, God, I got to remember those things, but I'm going through all of this as well. So the mental evaluation when they've been in your brain is scary because I'm not sure I'm the same person. My wife is pretty well convinced. She blames the doctor for not doing the personality improvements that she was asking for and all that good sort of stuff. But in general, I'm probably the same person that I was, but it is scary when you start to talk about that and they look at it. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is a transition to home. There's a chart I use when I give talks on digital health that I've been using for probably 7 or 8 years, and it actually came from Intel, and it's a chart that I didn't throw into the presentation, but basically it says the sooner you're out of the hospital, the better off you are, because A, the cost is going way down, and your level of satisfaction and well-being and all of that is going up. So the trick is get you out of ICU and into a regular unit. Get you out of the regular unit into some intermediate, and ultimately get you to home. So and their goal was to get me out of the hospital and into my home in Minnesota as soon as possible. My wife and sister had been told, expect 3 to 5 days in the hospital. On day 2, after 2 nights, the doctor said, well, you seem to be doing okay. Do you want to go home? And I said, I remembered my chart, said that's the best thing for me. You don't want to worry about infections. There's all those things you could talk about. And I called my wife and said, they're talking about bringing me home. And she panicked because she and my sister, who'd come in to help take care of me, basically said, well, we're not nurses. We don't know how to do this. And you're coming home, 48 hours, 56 hours to the hour after you've had brain surgery. We're not set up for that. Well, make a long story short, they did send me home after 2 days. I had to worry about pain management. I had to sleep upright for 6 weeks because my brain, I had a huge fluid buildup and had a big lump on the side, and I wasn't supposed to lay on it, and I had to let it heal and do all of that. I was supposed to rest, couldn't lift anything, and then they'd monitor what was going on. So, post-surgery, You know, this was in August, so from April to August, so 4 months later, you can see that the tumor's gone. I have some interesting hardware in my head. Apparently they put in something they call snowflakes, which are little titanium type things that go in there, and they put screws in them, and they bolt my skull back together, and they sutured the scalp back together, and that sort of stuff. And in general, you can see a little bit of stuff there, but there's a little bit of fluid that was still built up, and a little trauma there. But in general, my brain's expanding back to where it was supposed to be. How much did it really cost? I said I couldn't find out going in, but 6 months later, here's the answer. The medical costs, the bill that I got, said it was $107,000. And I think 60-some thousand of that was ICU, and 2 days in the hospital cost me something like 60 grand. The plan paid $55,000, so roughly half. My responsibility was $746. Gotta love insurance, right? I mean, you know, $107,000 negotiated to $55,000, and I paid $746. My pharma bill, because I didn't do a lot with the drugs and that, was $360, and I paid $67. So, you know, all in all, gotta love insurance. I have really, really good insurance. It took care of me. It was a great plan. You know, I got my money back for all that money I've spent on insurance and that sort of thing. Now, hopefully none of you will have to use your insurance policy in that fashion. But I had a high pay, very low deductible. That was my wife's policy for all those years that she was a teacher, and it took care of us. But if I'd gone into this trying to figure it out ahead of time, and if I tried to make decisions about what to do financially, I couldn't. There's no way. You cannot find that information out. So I could not make decisions on that, which is one of the reasons that people make decisions of, it's almost a digital situation. They either have health care or they don't have health care, because trying to find out what the sweet spot in the middle is really tough. It's getting better. I do believe in transparency, but the way we're structured and the things we do today just makes it really, really, really tough. So I'm coming near the end of the formal piece. Are there any other questions for right now? I think I've got one slide left or something like that. But other questions, thoughts, comments, similar experiences you want to share? Want to, you know, argue with me about what you went through? Yes, ma'am.
I would just say it sounds very complicated, but I could imagine that someone doesn't have insurance, so he's not educated. I just feel like, this is very complicated to me.
It is.
Listening to all that.
Yeah, I remember talking to you the other day. You're not from the States, you know, so you probably have a different health system that you're familiar with. Yeah, our system here is incredibly complex. And I'm a techie, and I've been building technology forever. And I absolutely believe that most of the problems in the healthcare system today are not technology. Yep, we're going to invent new ways to cure cancer. We're going to invent new diagnostic devices. The robotics conference is really cool because they've got new ways to do surgery and all of that. But I sat in one of the sessions this morning, and they said, yeah, well, the robots work and they do all of that, but you know what? We can't show that it's any more effective than having a surgeon do it directly so far.
There was a Time magazine expose a few years ago where they kind of pointed out if you didn't have insurance, you're going to be totally soaked.
Yes.
Because you have no power.
If you don't have insurance, then somebody's liable for a bill like that. One of the reasons, so to answer your question, yes, it's incredibly complex. That's why in this country, in many of the locales, primary health care is provided by emergency rooms. Because I think in most states, I might not be everywhere, and somebody correct me if you're an expert and know more about it than I do. In most states, if you go into an emergency room, they have to treat you. Okay, they can't turn you away. So a lot of people, particularly without insurance, which is one of the big reasons to push for, and I'm not advocating for or against necessarily universal health care. I do personally believe everybody should have insurance because we all get sick at some point in time, and it's a huge drain on society. How we get to that point is where I think the big debate is on whether you're a free market person or single payer or something like that. But the average person who hasn't gone through this, who hasn't figured it out, who doesn't have a good insurance program, they're at the whims of the system. They'll go to the emergency room, they'll get taken care of, and then those bills are incumbent upon the hospital or the institution to absorb. And if it's a public institution, then it's tax dollars that pay for it. So it is, the health system worked for me. The technology was superb. It was great. But the system of delivery and the way we pay for it and the things we do, we could arguably do quite a bit better. And I think that's where the real reform is in healthcare. I think we can cut a lot of costs, we can do a lot of things. I mean, I'm a device guy. I like building things and have built really cool stuff over the years. But in reality, the thing that's going to change us and save costs and do all of that is how we figure out how to reform, how we pay for it, what we do, you know, all of that sort of stuff. So as a person not from the U.S. and getting a look at this, I don't know what your system was like, but ours is confusing and complex, and it's difficult to wade through. And that's part of the message I have here. It really opened my eyes to the system. I'm thankful. I have an 87-year-old mother who's still alive. But we joke about it in my family because there's 3 boys and a girl, and we are very, very thankful that we have what we call an alpha daughter, because that alpha daughter is taking care of my mom, manages her health records, does all the stuff, keeps an eye on her, and she's still independent. She's 87 years old. She's in Sun City now. She'll be back in South Dakota in the summertime. She's on her own doing whatever, but I have a caregiver. My sister's manages her health care, even from 1,500 miles away. So there's a lot we can do to improve. So if the story comes through and says, A, there's a good moral in this, I came through it okay and everything worked out wonderfully well and I didn't have to pay a whole lot, but I'm educated, I'm an educated consumer, let's say it that way, and I have really, really good insurance. Outcomes for other people might not be quite as good. Other questions?
You know, one thing I've asked you before, I mean, if you had, you know, 2 people who might come work for you on a product, you know, development project, and all else being equal, like one has experienced a serious health emergency like this, another hasn't.
Right.
How valuable is that?
So I don't know if everybody heard the question. It was basically, how valuable is the experience of going through this? And if I had 2 engineers who were going to come work for me or 2 people who were going to come work for me, and one had gone through an experience and one hadn't, how would I weigh that? I will say I prefer people who've gone through it and have lived through it. Some of the best developments that are happening today, I spend some time in the diabetes space. And if you haven't looked at Bigfoot Biomedical, it's a great story to talk about because it's 2 gentlemen who have kids with type 1 diabetes and they're driven to solve a problem, which was, I'm going to connect up a glucometer. I'm going to get that information. I'm going to connect it. Because if you're a parent of a kid with type 1 diabetes, and you're waking them up every 2 hours to get the glucometer, the glucose signal out and doing that. It's a really painful process for you and for the kids. Some of the best innovations we have are being driven by people who have or have gone through something like that. In the eldercare market, I've done a lot of work with people in that space. Part of it's self-defense, you know. At some point, we're all in this room, and it's fun working on the eldercare stuff because at some point, we're all gonna need it. So if you want sensors in your house, if they want to know if you're up, around, going to the bathroom, whatever it is, and in some cases I'll say, my 87-year-old mom, we're going to monitor her that way and do all of that. But we're all going to need the healthcare system. We're all going to need some form of assisted living and monitoring and doing that. So I see where we talk about big data, the big data to be gathered today is in elder care, assisted living. What can we do to go make a difference in that space and that sort of stuff. So yeah, this made me hopefully a better systems engineer, designer, thinking about things. Some of those things I'm passionate about. You know, why is an MRI, well, I know why MRIs make that noise. Magnets relaxing and doing this, it's just going to bang and do that. But a few years ago, I met another story here. I met a gentleman named Dave. He and I were doing something for a company together. I was asked to talk about pulse oximeters or something. He was the guy who invented, who revamped the GE imaging systems. And he told the story, and he does a TED Talk on it, so I encourage it. Dave, I'm forgetting it. It was in that article you wrote. You'll have to look it up. And he told the story about being in a hospital. He was an engineering, industrial design guy. He'd been building these big machines and systems. And he watched a little girl, 4 years old, 5 years old, walking through the hospital with her parents. And she was on her way to get either an MRI or CT. And he got down on his knees to kind of look at the world from her perspective and what they were going through and all of that. And he said, I've got to make this better. And so he led the effort at GE and others to build CTs and MRs that have a theme to them, a space theme or a canoe theme or something along that, to take the mystery and scariness out of that for children. It's a wonderful story. I mean, he told it to a room full of engineers and managers when I first heard it. It was before the TED Talk times, and it was like there wasn't a dry eye in the house because it was very personal. And you think about all of that. So it is important for those of us who are designing products to keep in mind the patient. It used to be easy. Doctors used it, nurses used it, we designed it that way. Now we're taking all these things home. And so it's really important that people have experienced or seen it, or at least put themselves in the shoes of people who are going to use it.
I don't even, when I write my own articles, I try to avoid using the word patient because I think it's important for us to realize we're working on people.
I'll build on Chris's point. There is a movement that is person-centric healthcare, not patient, and a good friend of mine reminds me of that all the time. So you're right, I've used the patient word way too much. I was a person, I designed medical products, and I went through this process. And it gave me a new appreciation and understanding of both the frustrations as well as the promises of the technology that are there. So it was an interesting process. Some reflections now as I think through the before and after and what's going on here. I kind of touched on pay attention to your body. Don't ignore symptoms. For some reason, men have a tendency to do that more than women, and I did that. I probably had been showing symptoms for about a year to year and a half before I went in, and so I didn't listen to what my body was telling me. Navigating the medical system, that is not for the faint of heart. The young lady over here mentioned it seems really, really complex. It is. It is not easy. Get an advocate. Take somebody with you. Ask the questions. Do the things. Become an educated consumer. Don't trust the internet, by the way. There's a lot of good stuff there, but there's a lot of not so good stuff there too. Be your own advocate. Ask questions. The doctor who called me up to answer those questions and to take care of me. I found out later on when I was in the hospital and I'd gone through this, all the nurses, all the people there told me what a wonderful man he was and how good he was, and that people within the hospital really revered him. What we do matters. If you're designing a med device, if you're creating a system for it, if you're doing something like that, design for the patient before you are one. Design for the person. We're all people. Design for the person is what I should have written there. And tech is cool. I mean, all this stuff, we've devoted our lives to building and designing, and as I said, I'm laying in that MRI thinking I'm going through this. We're looking at wearables. We're doing all this. But you know, when I'm in the hospital, I'm laying there and I'm recovering, it's still about the people. It's about the nurses. It's about the doctors. It's about the guy who is wheeling me down to MRI again and all of that. It really still is about the people. If you're lucky, you're in an institution that has great people who care and want to take care of you. If you're not so lucky, you're in a factory, in essence, that they're pushing you through as quickly as possible. So find a good place to go when you go through this. Postscript. One of my goals of going through this, when this started in February and then in March when they discovered it, my wife and I had made a plan with 3 of our very best friends, 3 couples of us who've been friends for many, many, many years, raised kids together, do all this. We had planned 9 months before this, June 5th, we were supposed to leave for Alaska. I find out that I, in March, have a brain tumor, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. Could I put it off? My wife said, absolutely not. The doctor said, yeah, probably not. Do you want to be in Alaska and have your brain do something weird like the seizures that you're seeing? And my wife said, yeah, we don't want to do that. Then it became a goal of, can I have the surgery and get there? And the doctors would give me no guarantee because they don't know. They don't know what's going to happen. We made the goal a trip to Alaska with friends 5 days before. The doctor gave me a qualified clean bill of health saying, you got to promise me that you'll get up on the airplane and walk around all the time to prevent blood clots. They were less worried about my head. Here I am worried about my head's going to blow open when they pressurize the cabin and all of that. It was all about the blood clots. And we made the trip and had a great time. And as far as I know, I'm the same person, but I probably enjoy life a little bit more. I certainly enjoy friends a little bit more. But I am passionate about we got to fix our healthcare system. We got to build the right products, but we have to fix the system as well. And hopefully, my journey through kind of as an insider, looking at all the tech and the devices and all of that, I'm just scratching the surface here. We could talk about a lot more. Hopefully, it gives you a little perspective and insight as well. And if you're designing things, design them with yourself in mind, and hopefully you never have to use them. So, other questions, comments? There's my contact information. I'll hang out here. We've got time left. Yeah, go ahead.
It's wonderful to say design for people for your devices with people in mind. But what can we do to actively engage with the people, the patients? The biodesign programs follow doctors around, look for those gaps that need to be filled. Does that need to be replicated with patients? Do we need to be sitting through more of the healthcare experience?
Yeah, I think, there have been some nice talks here. Actually, the opening thing from Bryce yesterday on human factors design and all of that. He's actually a great guy, and they take the. So the good news is human factors has become an integral part of the design process. The FDA now mandates it, requires it. We're doing the formative and summative studies, but that's kind of late in the process and in the cycle. We have patients now that are a little bit different, and we have to reach out to them. We're going mobile now. I mean, having your phone be an ECG device. I've used a portable ECG system from AliveCore for 6 years because it was cool tech, and I knew the people who invented them, and I did that. And so I've been taking an ECG and sending it in once a month. Not because I have a heart problem, but it's cool and it's usable and it's easy, and they've improved it over that time. I still have the original. The case is falling apart, it's doing whatever, but it still works. They've now come out with a nice little one where you put your thumbs on it, and it's a nice little watch band in essence, so things improve. But yeah, we need to engage patients. I can't conceive. One of the problems with insulin pumps for many years is it made people look like they were sick. And that's why the adherence or the use of insulin pumps, which is a great device, has been less than 20%, I think, for many, many, many years because they made you look like you were ill, and all of that. I remember when Tandem introduced their pump. I was at the Diabetes Association meeting, and they're talking about this new insulin pump. And I'm not picking on Tandem. I have no relationship with them. Nothing there. It's just a great example that I use when I talk about consumer design in medical. The first 10 minutes of his pitch sounded like a new iPhone. It was made out of Gorilla Glass, it was waterproof, it had a color screen, its batteries lasted for this, literally. And I have a slide I use where I outline all of this. And it's kind of at the end, you want to ask him, well, how many songs does it really hold, or something like that. And at the end he says, and by the way, it's a really good insulin pump. And it is. But we've consumerized our devices, which is really good. Our phones in our pockets are teaching that. Having said that, I'm still a little bit of a purist, and that if you're going to use something to diagnose or treat a medical condition, it should be a medical device. It should have gone through the FDA. It should have been cleared. It should have done all of that. There are hundreds of thousands of apps out there that are labeled as health and wellness and medical. And if I remember right, I did the numbers. I think there's 213 apps as of in 2017 that have been approved by the FDA as a medical kind of an app. And if you look at the iPhone, God love the iPhone. I've used a bunch of them. I don't use them now quite, but if you read the instructions for use, it's interesting because you read through it, and of course they made such a to-do about, well, you can detect AFib, you can monitor your heart, you can do all this stuff. But if you read the instructions for use, at the very bottom it says, by the way, if you have AFib, don't use this device for trying to monitor it because it's not supposed to be used for that. It's an indicator device. Using your Fitbit for heart rate monitoring. There's a lawsuit going on now about that because it's not an accurate heart rate monitor. Good devices, it does certain things, but it's not a medical device.
I just thought 23andMe was a really interesting story. The fact that they started out and they were like, oh, we're going to do DNA tests on everybody, and it's like FDA was like, maybe people should be going and asking their doctors for cancer surgeries because this test that isn't
I love Medtech, but ask the questions and look at it, and it's incumbent upon us as medical professionals to put the devices in the right spot and use them the right way. 23andMe is a great story, as you point out. Find out all about this. We're going to diagnose genetic illnesses. We're going to do all these things, and then it turned into find out what country your ancestors came from, and they kind of backed off on that and all that. I believe in genomics. I believe it's going to be great. It scares me to death.
They've actually worked with FDA and came back around.
Yep. So, other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I thought one of the more interesting question was how did you find the best physician? And one of the problems we have is that there is no clarity on their quality, experience, skills. So you go default, like you said, male,
Yep.
as opposed to how many procedures that surgeon has. So have you found any kind of, is there any movement towards rating the physicians and their, so that you can make the best choice?
There is, but it's slow, and that's why I said there is some movement, but it's slow about transparency and finding out about physicians. There are efforts to rate them and grade them. United Health is located in Minneapolis, where I live, and they're the largest, I think, healthcare insurer in the country, and they have something like 55 million patients under a record or something like that. And they took a shot at this. A friend of mine ran the experiment in Phoenix, and they were looking at rating the clinics and rating the doctors and doing all of that. It's fraught with all sorts of problems, most of which are legal. And that's why even you'll read about cases where doctors are doing things and they're not getting reported, or they're slow to report. So everybody's worried about a lawsuit on something like that. And that's why you have major institutions with major physicians who've been malpractice, they've done things inappropriately, there's all of those sorts of things. So finding out how the average doctor is doing and what's going on, unless you talk to somebody. I mean, that my general practitioner is leaving. Now, as I mentioned, after 30 years, I said, Doc, where am I going to go? You know, some of these doctors I'm talking to, he showed me, well, here's a list of some guys that we have, and they're like this. And I said, when they look like a grandson to me, or like Doogie Howser, for those of us of a certain age who remember Doogie Howser, when they look really young and like that, it's hard to bare your soul as an old person, so to speak, to that individual and to rework that. And he said, you ask somebody else, you ask the other people, and that's what I'm doing with him, is he's going to recommend somebody to me. But if you go to a clinic or a physician or something like that, there is no good measurement yet. Heck, yeah, we don't rate teachers. I mean, I'm going a little bit astray here, but I was married to a teacher. I am married to a teacher, and my mother was a teacher. You can't even say anything bad about teachers, you know, let alone people who are holding your brain or your heart or your health in their hands. So I'm hopeful. I think there will someday be something that at least rates them on a general scale. I've not seen anything yet that does that, and I think it's more of a liability issue. Flip side of that, and there's a very real problem with it, Mayo Clinic. Love them, 60 miles from my house. I do a lot of consulting work with them. I've seen some miracles there. But if you compare some of their numbers to other hospitals, they sometimes come out a little bit worse. And part of the reason is because the really sick people go there. And you can't save everybody. And so you have to be careful because, you know, statistics will tell you what it is, you know, or what, you have to be careful the questions you ask because, so you get the right answers. And if we get too far over into that mode of judging people doing that, everybody will, you know, cram for the exam, they'll cram for the score, they'll take the easy cases, but they're going to ship the hard ones over somewhere else because they don't want to screw up their statistics. We found that with the Affordable Care Act. A great thing that helped change medicine to some extent in it was the 30-day readmission requirement. So it said if you're readmitted for the same condition, roughly, and within 30 days, there's a penalty that can be applied to your payments from Medicare. And so it's a penalty you pay not just on that individual, but broadly. So all of a sudden, you have hospitals that are looking at how do I manage that? That's the good part. How do I put devices in place? How do I manage their care? How do I do it better? On the other hand, some smart financial guy somewhere looks at it and says, you know what? If we don't have problem patients, then we don't have to worry about that as much. So there's a lot of things in that. Talk to people, ask people. I'm a big fan of rating. I know a company that's trying to do statistics on cost. And I actually called them. I said, here's what I'm getting done. Can we look at this? And we looked at it. I had a hard time identifying it, so we picked something easy. I forget what it was, a pacemaker implant or something like that. And they had huge statistics and cost variations and things like that for all over the country, depending on where you were going and what was happening and what was going on. And it's like my numbers there. Somebody goes and gets the same process done, their cost will be $100,000 because they don't have insurance. My case, it was $55,000 and I paid $800. So it's a great goal. It's not there yet.
You can ask the same question about hospitals. Because things like adverse reaction, infections, morbidity, mortality, and presumably that should be more documented, or again, is answered the same complicated answer?
Infections in particular. So the question is about monitoring hospitals and that sort of thing. Infections in particular are a big one. And if you've been in a hospital, I've seen so many devices that have been suggested for ways to make sure that people are washing their hands. Everything from their ID badge records how long they're in front of a sink when they're doing this, to you can't enter the door unless you use the hand cleaner. I mean, there are all sorts of gadgets for that. They're scared to death. The hospital's a really bad place to be because there's lots of weird bugs floating around in there. Infections they're sensitive to. Infections are probably one of the biggest things that they're trying to get their arms around. Big data will help in that. I'm aware of a company that actually is a spinoff out of Mayo. They're doing analytics. They're looking at pulling all the information in. They crunch the numbers, and this is based on 10 years of data gathered and 1,200 algorithms, and it predicts sepsis before you get the normal form, before it'll manifest itself in a really bad problem. They're just launching to market with it. They've got trials going on in hospitals, and it's really promising. But there's an example of where big data can actually help you. Looks at that pattern, looks at all that information, and predicts what's happening to you beforehand. So people are looking at that. And infection rates are something you can measure, but again, they're subject to, where are you, what's going on, what practices have you put in place. But that's probably the best example you can point to where hospitals are really trying to do something. Other questions, comments?
Just a brief comment. You can go to the CMS site, cms.gov, and you can get facility rankings and quality metrics reported on infection specifically and some other things like that. I'm from that side of the industry. Spent 5 years managing a neuroscience institute, so I've got a lot of feels for you, what you went through. And there is a big move on that side of the industry from the competitive standpoint to publish metrics on hospital websites. And I'll say this, as hospitals go, so will their surgeons. If the surgeons are not doing well, the hospital metrics will indicate that. Find a nurse that's a friend, and we'll tell you to see it in the community. So.
Yeah. I mean, I was able to find out that in the community, I live in the Twin Cities. We have some of the finest healthcare in the world and great opportunities. I went to a hospital that specializes in neurosurgery. There are a couple of them there, and so pick one that specializes in what you do first, and start there because they probably know how to handle those things. So look at that. But we're a long ways from making it really, really easy. I mean, it's painful. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, I'm not sure if you know the answer, but is there any country that that does a good job managing, I guess, healthcare costs versus quality of care? Any model that makes a lot of sense?
Well, there's a discussion earlier today, I mean, that ties to the whole value chain movement in healthcare. How do you tell, and because sometimes you can come up with a price. But then you get to that issue of what value is associated with that price. And the example that I use when I've been asked that before is, and I probably have the exact numbers wrong, but they're approximately correct. There's a new cancer drug that came out. And it cost, I think, $25,000 more than the existing course of treatment. Okay? And so it's 25 grand. That's a big deal. And it may or may not have been covered by insurance. And when you looked at the statistics behind that 25 grand, it in general helped some percentage of those patients last 6 weeks longer, okay? So is $25,000 in 6 weeks of life worth it? And the answer is it depends. If you see your daughter married or your grandkid graduate or something like that, $25,000 might be well worth it, or it might not be. There was a case in Minnesota, a young girl, if there's a treatment that she was going to have to take for the rest of her life. I forget, some sort of genetic disease that they had. And they have a drug that they could keep giving her, and it would cost something, Chris, maybe you remember the numbers, it was like $10,000 or $12,000 a month for the rest of her life, okay? And it would help treat that. Or there was a new treatment that had been proven to work, and it was shown to be effective, but it had to be given before they were 2 years old. But it was $2 million, and the health insurance would not cover it. So it was all over our news, and they were talking about how horrible this is because you've got this beautiful little child. And the thing is, she was about 4 weeks from her second birthday. And so, if she got past that, she couldn't get the drug. Before it, they're staring at a bill of $2 million. And is that worth more than the $100,000 or $10,000 a month that it's going to cost for the rest of her life? And ultimately, I think the governor intervened, and there were some things, and there's a lot of pressure applied. I mean, they were doing GoFundMe pages and all sorts of stuff. And she got the drug, right, like the week before or something like that. And as far as I know, she's doing well, and hopefully they'll do a follow-up on it. But it's those kind of trade-offs that you have to make. What's the value associated with it? Healthcare, okay, I'm a device guy, so we've been building devices for a long time. Healthcare is the last field probably where the cost of what you're building, let's say bill of materials, for the hardware people in here, it's bill of materials cost, right? In the consumer world, you have a bill of materials cost that leads to a product cost, and it's pretty transparent. In medical, it doesn't work that way. A pacemaker might cost $2,000 worth of material, but it's $30,000 to buy an implant and do something like that. So the connection between cost and value is really tenuous today. So the answer is it depends. As we move to value-based healthcare, there will be more discussions like that. There will be more things that have to happen there. For me, it was great value. My head got fixed and it cost me $800. Okay, that was an easy equation for me. Now, the fact that I was paying, see, it was my wife's stuff, caring family, it was $1,000 a month for that insurance. So do the math. It was $100,000, so I could do the math and say it was 8 years worth of premiums or whatever it was, and so it worked out. So yeah, but value-based healthcare, big debate. I look forward to it. It's, I think, going to help change things, but it's not there yet. I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes. I'll turn it back over to Tom. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit about the journey and can learn something.